You're very welcome back to another episode of the Executive Code podcast. As you know, you can get this access to this podcast on any of your podcast platforms, or you can also access the video version of the podcast on our YouTube channel. All the links are in the show notes, and you can also go to our website, paulwilliamdavis.com, to find all the links, other resources, and also be able to access our online community called the Executive Code. So I'm joined here with Nicole, and she's got more questions that she wants to ask and delve a little bit deeper into particular material. So over to you, Nicole, as regards what the next question you have is.
Thanks, Paul. So I don't know if you've read the book Outliers, but last year during the whole lockdown, I had a lot of time to read, and that was one of the books I went through. Even though I've had the book for years and years, I only got through it last year. So one of the things that stood out to me in the book was when the author Malcolm Gladwell pointed out that one of the biggest factors of success was a person's sense of entitlement. Yeah, so he compared the person with the highest IQ in the US with Robert Oppenheimer, who most people know led the Manhattan Project but created the atomic bomb. And after examining their lives, Gladwell concluded that the difference between their career trajectories was because one blamed the world for its lack of success, while the other felt the world owed him success. So, do you agree that, contrary to popular belief, a sense of entitlement is not always a bad thing?
It's part of, but when I think about the question, I'm actually drawn to quite a number of other things, because what it does highlight in the book, or if you read it from a different understanding or a different reading from it, if you're to look at it, I don't think you can compare like with like, because it's not necessarily comparing apples with apples with two individuals that are described in the book. So if you take Langham's background, for example, or you take Oppenheimer's background, they're two very, very different backgrounds. So really what you want to look at is what's the environment that both individuals came up with. So you had one which had not so great upbringing and very few financial resources. If you were to look at the sphere of influence that Langham had, it would be very, very different to the sphere of influence that Oppenheimer had, and the money that he had access to, and the level of the people that he had around him in terms of support, getting out of different holes that he found himself going into, and so on. So I think that there's an awful lot more at play of what actually made the individual successful, as in if you compare those two individuals in particular. But what it really, really highlights from my perspective is that intelligence isn't the determining factor for being successful. So I would agree from the perspective of, can you have an individual that will blame their life or blame their circumstances or blame what's happened in their life for not being successful? You can absolutely have that, absolutely. But on the other side, what you got to understand is that, when you understand the law of cause and effect, you actually realize that you are in control of your life in every single aspect of your life. So when you operate from that point of view, well, then now you can actually do something about it. So no matter what circumstances you grew up in, whether you had a really, really desperate childhood or a lower upbringing as a financial upbringing and so on, you can still be, and there's hundreds of examples of this, whereby you can still be hugely successful. So it's not necessarily down to, the financial resources or the people that you have around you or whatever. You can still be successful no matter what your background is. And what Gladwell really, if you were to read the book in a different way, what you'll actually learn is that actually intelligence doesn't actually make much of a difference, which is great for me because I'm not one of those highly intelligent individuals. So it just means that people can actually, it's not a determined factor for actually achieving success. If you were to ask me, which is your question, from the perspective of is entitlement a bad thing? What you got to look at is that if you understand what entitlement is, it's people's definition of entitlement. So entitlement really means is that you are, you're entitled to something. Now, if the entitlement, I'm going to bring it back to the genius pendulum, if your entitlement goes to the point of view whereby it's out of equilibrium, and therefore now you're looking down on people, well, that's not necessarily a good thing. So if your entitlement is from the point of view of in equilibrium, so if you look at it from and understand from this side of things, if you think of it from a humanized ego perspective, people can have a sense of entitlement with them, but really what they're doing is they're looking down on people. So that's where their genius pendulum is actually out of equilibrium. And circumstances will be created in order to give them feedback, but also to bring them back into equilibrium. So that's going to happen anyway for those people. But if you go a little bit further, and I wrote this in my first book, which I call Evolve. And in the book, I described successful people. And what it really comes down to is a number of different factors. So one is their perceptions of how they view the world. It's their beliefs that they actually have from an unconscious perspective. But they also feel that they have a right to be successful. And that's very different from an awful lot of people, because some people don't have that absolute belief, that conviction, which is a more better term than entitlement, I would say. It's that conviction that they know they can absolutely be successful. So once you have that absolutely strong belief that you can be successful in no matter what it is that you're trying to achieve, now that belief overrides everything from the perspective of when you understand that you are the cause of all that happens in your world. So therefore, when you overlay that from a belief perspective, now it has a direct impact on what it is that you can achieve in your life. If you look at it from the perspective of self-worth, if you believe that you have the right, or I don't really like the word entitlement, but think from the perspective of you have the right to be successful. You have the right to bring and to have good things in your life. Well, then now that's going to have a direct impact from your self-worth and your self-care perspective. So I would prefer to use, to think from the point of view of a conviction, or to have a right to something, as opposed to entitlement. People's perceptions of entitlement is where somebody's looking down on something or looking down on other people. So is that a bad thing? From my perspective, there's both good and bad in every single situation. So it's neither good nor it's bad, but it's people's perceptions of a person that is out of equilibrium will have a higher sense of entitlement, and therefore they are looking down on people. That can have good and bad. It depends on which way you look at it.
And for some background, Chris Langham was the smartest person with the highest IQ in the U.S. I think he had something like 198, IQ, and he actually was smart enough to get a scholarship to college. I think it's been a while since I read the book, but this is what I remember off the top of my head. So he got a scholarship to study engineering or something. And then for some reason, his really old car broke down and he couldn't get to classes because it was like 20 miles away, right? In the US, you can't walk anywhere. I don't know about Ireland. But yeah. But so he couldn't get to attend classes. And for some reason, his professor was not convinced that his car actually broke down. I think he couldn't get, the materials to study in advance, or couldn't get them faxed to him. This was back in, I think, the 80s, or this was the 40s, I guess, or even earlier. And so he eventually dropped out of school and blamed the whole system for his misfortunes. And would you say it's very much, at least at the start, is very much a issue of privilege? Because, you compare Chris with Oppenheimer. Well, the lives, as you mentioned, were very different, and there was a lot of privilege. And the book also talks about how Oppenheimer he had sort of charm where he was able to convince people to do things for him. And so it wasn't just, a money aspect. It was more of a, persona and being able to convince people, right, to get them on your side. So it's privilege, but it's also more than that, isn't it?
It is. Absolutely is. So did Oppenheimer have an advantage? Of course he had, because he had the wealth, he had the people around him, he had the support network, he had everything, not everything, but he had the vast majority of those things that are literally going to leapfrog him in his success levels. Whereas Langham didn't. But is it to say that Langham can't achieve the same level of success? He absolutely could have achieved. Um, but
it would have been harder for him.
Say that to me again, Nicole.
It would have been harder for Langham.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So is there a sense of, you use the term privilege. Is there a sense of privilege there? There absolutely, and there is, and you can say that about a lot of people that are born into wealth, or what will people refer to as new money, for example, or there are children that are born into a family that has been hugely successful, and therefore they have a lot of money. So in all the businesses that I've been involved in, and a number of them would have been family-run businesses, and there is the typical rhythm that you'll find is where the first generation will make the money, the second generation will spend it, and the third generation now have to recover it if the business hasn't gone underground by that stage. So the second generation have come into a situation of privilege from that perspective. It really then boils down to, okay, so how do they want to run or use the money that they have access to for either for good or bad, or whichever way you want to look at it? What do they want to turn that and use the resources of that privilege into what it is that they want to do?
And so how can we, on an individual level, kind of level the playing field? Not all of us have come into this world with a different set of resources, different levels of privilege. And so what are the ways that we can actively take to manage our resources in an effective and efficient way to maximize our potential, basically?
You take control of your life. It's as simple as that.
Take action.
Yeah. You literally take control of your whole life. So it gets back to the law of cause and effect. You are in control of every single aspect of your life. So you can have a situation whereby, look, at circumstances show up and you can see that circumstance or those challenges as being blockages or speed bumps or hurdles to get over. But there's other people that they will see those challenges and they will be decimated by those challenges. And that's the difference. There's so much evidence in the world from the perspective of, you'll get somebody that will, for what people perceive as failed in business, but they'll get back up again and they'll continue on and build another business, and then another business after that. Whereas there's other people that will, again, perceived to be failed at business, and their whole world falls apart. So, as I said on one of our previous episodes, whereby their whole identity has been in that business, and therefore they're literally just decimated as a result, and therefore don't pick themselves up from the perspective of, okay, let's go again. Now, is it hard? Yeah, absolutely. Of course it's hard. But what is it that you want to get out of life? What's the difference you want to make? Do you want to, if you're not happy with the circumstances you have that you're in right now at the moment, the only person that is responsible for getting out of the circumstances that you're in is you. It's as simple as that. So there's nobody to blame. And a lot of people in the world do blame other people. They blame the governments, they blame society, they blame, organizations, they blame the financial situations and so on. Yes, they have a hand in part, but there's a difference between some people taking control of their lives and say, actually, you know what, that's what's happened, but how can I see it as a way for me to springboard my life and to move myself forward, as opposed to handing over the control to somebody else. And what I mean by that is handing over the control to the governments and just follow what, that's what's happened in the economy. So therefore, I just have to put up with it, or hand control over to the banks, financial institutions, or circumstances, or the company that's made them redundant, or whatever it actually happened. So rather than just handing over your control to somebody else, it's actually about you taking control of your life and then seeing what it is that you want to achieve. That's ultimately what it gets down to. It actually gets back down to you as an individual taking control. Does that make sense?
Yep. And it's good to know we don't need a IQ of 198 to be successful.
Absolutely.
or have a lot of money.
Yeah, there's so much history there in terms of the number of people that have made significant financial profits and business success from a very, very meager background. So you're absolutely right. Not down to intelligence, and it's not down to, yes, it money helps. There's no two ways about it. It's how we currently, run our economy in terms of money. So yeah, money is as important as oxygen up there right now at the moment. But it's a case of, what are the actions that you're going to take in order to actually move yourself forward.
And actually, I just thought about another chapter in the book on how our successes as a generation are affected depending on when we were born in time. So, for example, if you look at, I'm not sure if you remember that chapter, it talked about like Bill Gates and, Steve Jobs, and you look at them and you'll see that they were all born in more or less the same decade. And that's because when they were young, that's when the computers were, really becoming more mainstream. And as like teenagers, they would spend all their time working on computers and programming and things like that. So when they were, like in the 20s or 30s, they already had that experience from, the decade before. And that's how they were able to springboard that experience and, knowledge into building Microsoft and Apple and all the internet empires. So it was interesting to see how we are definitely a product of our times as well as a generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a product of our times, product of our environment. It's everything. So it'd be interesting to see, based on the generation that's coming into the workforce right now at the moment, in 10, 20 years time, what's the impact going to be? So there's a lot of talk, for example, about sustainability, about trying to save the earth and so on. So it'd be interesting to see what businesses now are going to be created over the next, say, 10, 15 years, and which ones of those are going to be significant successes, just as much as the likes of Microsoft or any one of those, Apple, for example. So yeah, let me put it this way: it's, as we said before, everything follows a rhythm. So it's a case of what's happening in the world right now at the moment, and how are people reacting to it, and how are people seeing the opportunity of what's actually available based on what's actually happening right now at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen in 10, 15 years, and other people looking back on the current generation and reporting, as you say, Nicole, in terms of look back and saying, well, that was the phase that those people went through in relation to the pandemic phase, and what were the opportunities that came out of that and made multi-million euro companies as a result.
Yep, and I'm going to test this theory, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson are all kind of born within 10, 15 years of each other. I don't know for sure. I can look it up after this, but that would be in line with the theory that which generation we're born in, within 10, 15 years. That's how the most successful people in the field, which generation they're from. So yeah. That's just something I came up with.
Absolutely. And it also gets down to how big is your inspired vision? How big do you want to think? So those guys think, into space. That's like they literally think so big. So it's how big do you want to actually think for your own life perspective, but also from the business that you want to run or whatever. So it's a lot of factors, but absolutely interesting. Yeah.
Success is very much a convergence of many, many different circumstances, factors, and it's a really complicated topic to research, really.
Yeah, and unravel. That's why there's so many MBAs and so many business schools, all teaching quite similar. 80% of it is the same, but it ultimately gets down to the individual. That's what I've discovered. And the biggest way, or the fastest way for somebody to achieve their full potential and achieve the success that they want, is actually being on purpose, because now you're aligning your genius, you and your unconscious, with what it is that you want to achieve. So if you look at any one of those that you mentioned, whether it be Richard Branson, Elon Musk, any one of those people, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, they were absolutely driven to achieve what it is that they want to achieve. And everything else comes from that, in terms of they're utilizing everything that's unconscious to them, and from a beliefs perspective, and what it is that they can actually achieve. And that's what makes them so successful. And let's put it this way, some people give out about them, other people say good things about them. It's the law of duality again. So people say, because I see it on social media, whereby they're flying to outer space, and why not actually do work on land, on Earth, as opposed to spending money out of space? It's always both sides. It's always good and bad. Law of duality.
And we have to remember that, success to everyone is different. So I'm not sure if when, for example, Elon Musk, when he started off, I don't think he imagined, or he had the goal of becoming, the richest man in the world. These people, they just worked at what they loved and were driven to succeed. They wanted to go to Mars and things like that. And then the money came along and people perceived them as successful.
Yeah.
So it's funny how, some of the most successful people, in the world were not driven by money.
They're not. No, they actually see it as a vocation. So if you read up much about Elon Musk and what he's driven by and so on, from a very, very young age, he was driven because he wanted to save the earth. That was his whole driving force. So there's always a reason behind the individual as regards what they're driven for. But in the first book that I wrote, again, Evolve, what I say in that is they are never, ever, 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 ever focused on the money. They'll calculate as part of running the business, but that's not their driving force. Their driving force is what it is that they want to achieve, what their mission is. It's unfortunately, a lot of people get hung up in chasing the money, and that's where it doesn't become a success for them.
So we should never be chasing the money then.
No. Bottom line, no. It's a measure. It's absolutely a measure. But if you're chasing it and that's your focus, well, then a lot of other things will come into play in order for it not to be the success that you envisage that you want it to be. No.
And sometimes that's easier than, for some people than others. Because I think I read somewhere that Elon Musk, he used to eat ramen noodles and live in like a really tiny apartment when he was, just starting out SpaceX. So not everyone can afford to live like that, is what I'm
No.
You still need, especially if you have people depending on you, you have a family, you have to have money to support these people depending on you. So
exactly, yeah.
It's
important, but it doesn't become. It's not to be. Here's a word of caution. It's not to be your main focus. You use it as a measure, and you absolutely keep an eye on it from a business perspective. But if in order to actually achieve the level of success that you want to achieve, it shouldn't be your main focus. Yeah.
So the main focus.
Even if you look at Warren Buffett and read any of his books, or even listen to any of his episodes, you'll actually find he doesn't do it for the money. It's a scorecard. It's his whole focus is not from a perspective of looking at money. It's a measure. That's all it is. And that's how any successful individual, what people perceive as being successful, most people perceive success as being financial wealth. But if you do any research from that perspective, what you'll actually find is that their focus is never around the money. So
it's almost like a game to them.
It is, yeah. It is, yeah.
Because if it were about the money, they would have retired, once they hit their, first billion or second billion, but they're still working. You don't see them stopping at all.
No, because that's they perceive it as being a vocation, and that's the whole thing. So when you're coming from that space and you're absolutely dedicated to delivering on what it is that you want to achieve and your mission, absolutely, you'll work as many hours as you possibly can in order to actually achieve it. Yeah.
So then our main focus should be on our genius mission, correct?
Yeah. Our genius mission. Yeah.
That's what would deliver our version of success.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Now, all of them work together, as what we said on an earlier episode, between your genius drivers, your genius quest, your genius role, and your genius inspiration. All of those four elements work together, and that's how you'll actually achieve your success. Yeah.
The genius you.
The genius you, exactly. Yeah. See, you're learning. We're all getting there. Absolutely, no, it's brilliant. Okay, guys, so that's what we've discussed today is all about success. And one of your takeaways is that you don't have to be hyper intelligent to be a success. It's not a determining factor, which I am so glad of. Thank God for me, because I'm not up there in terms of intelligence. I'm just somebody that's driven and on a mission. So I hope you enjoyed the content from today's episode. If you want to find out more and you want to get involved in the conversations, come on over to our online community. You'll find the links in the show notes, or if you go to our website, paulwilliamdavis.com, you'll find links there on the website as well. We'd love to have you in the community because, again, if you like this content, you'll get an understanding or a flavor of the kind of conversations that we have within the executive coach community. You'll be very, very welcome. But until next time, I wish you every success.